Hey there, and welcome to Manufacturing Mavericks from TBGA. I'm John Barnes, founder of the Barnes Global Advisors and Metal Powderworks. I'm a materials engineer, a girl dad, and stakeholder of two golden retrievers. I'm glad you're joining us. Each episode, we shine a spotlight on the people pushing the boundaries of advanced manufacturing. We explore the edge of technology, dive into the economics, issues, trends, and critical ideas with a special emphasis of the exciting world of additive and advanced manufacturing. We know there's more to work than just work, so we dig into leadership stories, life lessons, and the quirks that make this field fun. And yes, you can count on some dad jokes and puns along the way. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into it and meet the people who are making manufacturing what it is today. Joining me today is Danny Piper. Danny is the managing partner at Newcap Partners, based in Los Angeles, a private investment bank specializing in mergers and acquisitions for the middle market. You'll have to explain what that actually means to us. But he began his career as an Air Force acquisition officer, and he is a Air Force Academy graduate. Welcome to the show, Danny.
John, thanks for having me. Jennifer, thanks as well. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and so you're the first. I've been flying solo on this podcast for a while, but today I finally made a smarter decision and I brought in a partner. So Jennifer Coyne from Barnes Global Advisors. Welcome to the co-pilot seat, Jen.
Glad to be here and really glad to have this conversation with you and Danny today. I'm excited.
Yeah. So for the record, Jen is director of programs at TBGA, mechanical engineer. I think she would describe herself more as a systems engineer, which is why she's so good at programs. She's a mom, she's a runner. She's also my neighbor, so we don't, it's not a requirement at TBGA, but it does make life interesting. So I have an aerospace themed dad joke for you, given your Air Force connection. What's an astronaut's favorite part of the computer?
Ooh, you got me on this one.
The space bar. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so help us understand how you go. You would go from Air Force Academy, Air Force. That's a natural progression, and you're an acquisition officer. I think you said you're overseeing about 56 billion in space contracts to private investment banking. How was tell us a little bit about that progression from Air Force Academy to private investment and mergers and acquisitions.
Sure. So my first assignment in the Air Force, coming out of the Air Force Academy, was up in Silicon Valley. We used to have a space operations center there in Sunnyvale. It was the first real main sort of space operations center, hence Silicon Valley and the use of silicon chips. Space program was one of the largest user of those. And so the infrastructure, the team, the technology, it made sense to build that first operations center in there. And so we had a number of mission profiles from some of our more classified agencies working in there to Space Command for weather satellites. And we did tertiary backup to the space shuttle behind the Cape and Houston. So for any software hardware modification going into command and control satellites and are the changes to the network, all the satellite antennas that were remotely positioned around the globe, my unit was involved in managing any upgrade or changes to those. So I actually was sort of the on-site customer liaison, primarily to the classified community. So I would manage, and I had teams of engineers, predominantly from Lockheed and Loral, that would go into those rooms, and we would manage the installs and changes. The main area we would do acquisition work and buy most of our satellite components, systems, launch vehicles was what used to be called Los Angeles Air Force Base, now Space Force Base in El Segundo. So my second assignment, I wanted to get down to El Segundo area. I live in Hermosa Beach. I always tell people I started going down there for work, and I saw that you could be in the Air Force and live by the beach. And I got here in 1997. I said, okay, great. Now I'm never leaving. So I got involved into strategic planning for the center. So I was working long range roadmaps between the National Reconnaissance Office and the Air Force Space Command and Air Force Materiel Command. And so that's sort of where I was going. And then I got tagged in to be an exec to some of the generals that were there before I got out. I sort of knew I was going to get out. I think the career path for space acquisitions guys was sort of limited. And I think I had a desire to, one, live by the beach too. And so I made the exit from the Air Force in early 2000. and transitioned into a little bit of consulting, but by 2001 got into investment banking, doing M&A work. So I originally had thought that I would focus in on maybe buying a company, but I enjoyed the transaction process. I enjoyed meeting all these companies, going through them, learning, and it was sort of a fascinating endeavor. And I really started honing in on and going into more of the manufacturing side of the world, largely composites. Was where I
Hmm.
spent a lot of time looking at the various manufacturing processes, things like resin transfer molding, out of autoclave, what the economics were, and having an understanding of engineering systems and working with engineers, it really led me down into the manufacturing path. And so when 3D printing came along, it really was a really interesting transition and closely aligned to composites. So I've always focused in on that area. You'd asked the question early on about middle market. So a lot of the investment bankers you're going to have on, if you get to the JP Morgans of the world, the Cantors, they're the Wall Street firms. They're doing all of the large deals of the world. Innovation lives at the smaller company level, typically. And so I think that's sort of where I liked working with the founders. I liked where the development of new technologies, new capabilities existed. So for me, focusing in on smaller companies from startups to sort of I'll call them up to like 10 to 15 million of EBITDA is about where we sit. And then all the big banks come in, and when you see the billion-dollar plus deals, it's not us. But innovation largely lives in these kind of sub $200 million transactions. And that's where we spend most of our time.
Yeah, I think my time at Lockheed Martin, there was a firm respect for a lot of innovation happens outside the fence. And so, going and dealing with these smaller firms, was important to us. And we had numerous programs, borrowing technology from bicycle manufacturing, surfboard manufacturing, high performance kites, things like that. So that was just what I got into. Was there a connection there? Like, what did you learn at the Air Force in this process that kind of helped get you into I guess one, it turns you on to this investment premise and the M&A piece of it, but you know, is there
Yeah.
more to it than that? Or I mean, was it translatable, or what would you get from the Air Force that you wouldn't have got if you just gone straight to Wall Street?
Well, I think there are some things that are translatable. Matter of fact, I think if you look at a lot of the large investment banks, especially in the A&D practice areas and the industrial practice areas, there's a lot of ex-military. And that's largely, it gives you some visibility into the government contracting cycles and how that works, what the colors of monies are, how budgetary process goes. So when you evaluate companies, especially in manufacturing that are doing aerospace defense, you have to understand the programs behind it to really understand the scope and where these programs are going to go. And I think that's something that it gave me probably a leg up from people that didn't have that exposure. One, and then two, actually working and having done sort of the project management and engineering role for some of these contracts gives you some visibility in terms of what qualification processes look like and what are the real standards that you've got to meet to go into real production programs. How do we make decisions along these various milestones from, because when we manage contracts and project managers, you're talking about requirements definition all the way to the end of life. So all the critical design reviews that you would go through. So you have sort of in your DNA built in, at least as a starting point for 6, 7 years, running through engineering programs. So when I walked in to look at some of these companies, I had a baseline understanding that maybe somebody who just walked out of an MBA program and hadn't worked in government before and or engineering programs, a way to communicate and understand what these companies were going through in a way that they probably didn't understand. So I think there was a little bit of a competitive advantage for smaller,
Hmm.
companies. So I think that's sort of one of the assets I got out of being in the Air Force first.
Maybe now I have a question for Jen because you mentioned colors of money and programs of record, and Jen, so I've been in defense so long, like yeah, okay, yeah, I had heard what you said, it made total sense to me. I think Jen's had to come in from outside of this world, so the colors of money, programs of record, I think these things probably sounded like a weird expression, but now it's second nature to you. But you can imagine from a small manufacturer, like, hey, you just want to make some parts for
Yeah.
the Defense Department. So I
Yeah.
guess my question is like somebody who's come into this more recently, knowing what you know now, I guess There's a question in there somewhere. I'm not sure what it is, but go.
Yeah, no, I think part of the question is like, how easy is it to enter from outside for those small innovative companies? Like you said, Danny, that innovation tends to come out of the smaller companies. Those companies may have a background in defense, they or government and at large, they may not, right? And so how do you get them in there? How do you get them up the learning curve? And I think there's a few people that we've had the privilege to work with near at TBGA that have helped us along that learning curve, helped me along that learning curve coming from outside of the defense and aerospace world. But it's been a journey to understand the contracts and how they work and positioning for them and like I think about some of these companies who are living off SIBRs or smaller type of sustaining type contracts and how they transition into production and I wonder how many of those you really interface with, right? And
Yeah, we a lot of them actually. I think there's some value in the SBIR program. There's obviously a lot of other problems with SBIRs, but I mean, when I think about your background's interesting because you spent a fair amount of time at GE, sort of working through engineering programs, and I'm sure a number of those kind of crossed over into aerospace defense. So you didn't maybe weren't doing all the contract management type work, but I think understanding the tempo and time and decision making frameworks that you probably went through set you up well to where you are today, is my guess.
the segment I was in was mostly commercial, but well, everything was commercial in government terms. But I would say we sold to governments, but not in aerospace and defense. I worked on locomotives, but what was similar to that is, a locomotive is 430 some thousand pounds, 40,000 pieces, takes, 6 months to build. They're not small. They're not lacking complexity. So I think any of these large platforms that we talk about that whether or not the deal is complex because of the contract or the money cycle or whatever, like the product is complex and the complexity of the product is part of how people move slowly as well, right? And it brings me back to something you said a minute ago around how you were more prepared coming into this space financially because you could look at something because you understood the engineering complexity, right? And how a system comes together. And that like qualification word comes up and it's thrown around a lot. And I think oftentimes maybe without understanding or full understanding of what that means. And I recall like a really good story that you told while we were chatting prior about just how the expectations around financial performance oftentimes don't take into account the realities of qualification. So can you talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think it's such an important area, especially when you think about, and I want to make sure maybe for everybody listening, when I think about the world of investments into like 3D printing and manufacturing, there's really two different worlds. There's the venture capital side of the world and the private equity side of the world. And private equity buys existing companies, already engineered products that they're already in the market. They usually don't go through these cycles. They're risk averse. They're the glass half empty people of the world. The glass half full people of the world are the venture capitalists. They want to make the world a better place. Their time horizon is let's do something new. And so they're the ones that have to kind of walk right into these qualification cycles. And it's something that most venture capitalists, I think, especially those in Silicon Valley, understand software really well, and they've lived in that environment. When you get into materials and manufacturing processes, it's a lot harder for them to wrap their brain around it. The cycles and you have a high reliability system with low failure, potential that you can't afford the risk. So the qualification processes elude them sometimes, and so they think that they fund these companies and they can go faster than they can. And now I will throw out a huge credit to the SpaceXs of the world who've absolutely moved the needle so fast in terms of designing, hardware changes and systems. They've set a new pace, but it's such a it's lost on how companies coming in with new materials, especially. I think that's the hardest area to invest in. how long it takes for that material one to get qualified into a process, and then that process then has to get qualified into, parts, and then the part has to
Mm.
get qualified. So it's a funny word, right? Because I think you're nailing it. It's not one thing, it's a series of qualification steps. And I think that's where there's just a problem in the manufacturing side of the world of what does this really mean? How long does it really take? And I think a lot of investors have kind of come and gone in these cycles where they've gotten burned because it just takes longer than they've ever anticipated. And so we saw a lot of this, all the fundings that went in up to about 2021 post COVID, early 2022, the bottom, hits in the funding cycle. And now all of a sudden, if you weren't getting new fundings for the next couple of years. So this is something where companies that weren't well positioned, that needed more money, there was a lot of additive that just kind of fell off the cliff. And so it's because largely the investors just didn't understand what was going to be required from a time standpoint. And you just can't throw money at the problem sometimes. It's actually you have to do the work.
Yeah, you got to throw time on it. I still recall one of my first investment cycles where I was asking for money at my previous role, and they were like, "You need to show a 1.5 year ROI." Okay, that's going to be easy.
Right. Exactly. And I think that's where, if you think about what the way VC funds and private equity work, there's a similarity to them. They're usually 10-year funds. And so they get a couple years to organize and deploy the capital. Then they have, call it 5, 6 years while it's sort of deployed into the companies. And then they need to get a return back to their limited partners, the investors in those funds. So by years, 7, 8, 9, they've got to be selling these companies. So it's one of those things where the 1.5 year, it's hard to innovate. And this is where private equity, I'm sort of hard on private equity when I say private equity is usually where innovation goes to die because they can't afford what they really want to do is maximize the bottom line of a company, the EBITDA, the profitability of a company. And it's hard to do that when you're spending a lot of R&D dollars and development dollars that are necessary for a 10-year growth horizon and you need to get it done in a year and a half. It just doesn't work.
I guess the focus on hard tech versus software, like our VCs, like this, I think probably where they've come from. 20 years ago, VCs, I don't think really existed. So, but it's a different thing. And so, is it widely understood the differences between software and what I call hard tech or manufacturing of like a physical object that's got to go undergo testing, and it seems like the testing never ends because you learn things about the following test that requires, more testing.
There are very few VCs that have done it well, and because I think that they don't understand it. We were involved in one transaction in composites where the founding team was put aside, where they brought a new CEO in, who, by the way, had a degree, aerospace engineering degree, closely aligned to yours, from Purdue, and a great
I
guy
like them
overall.
already.
He had never worked in aerospace. He had gotten a job with Amazon in doing sort of the building out their global web services businesses, and then Google hired him to be, the lead of their cloud business. So all of a sudden, he had all of the things that I think a VC would love to have as somebody with experience in growing in a Google and an Amazon environment, but you drop them into now an engineering environment. And when it's a manufacturing process and or a material, you don't control how fast the customer can adopt it. Where I think this is the fallacy I think some of the VCs get tied up in is if you're designing your own rocket, you're going to eat your own dog food and you can control sort of the speed at which you're going to go. You're designing the whole system. And so if I'm funding the whole system, then I can sort of dictate a little bit more of the speed cycle. If I'm servicing somebody who's designing that rocket or that airplane, I have to go at the speed at which they're designing those airplanes. So in the world of like, 3D printing for, I would say commercial aviation, you're at the mercy of whenever Boeing or Airbus is going to design the next airframe because it's unlikely they're going to requal. So timing really matters. You don't really get control of the timing when you are, I'll call it the cog in the wheel rather than the whole wheel.
Yeah, and I see that a lot, when I talk to from the metal powderwork side, and I've tried to be honest with everybody on the investment side to that exact point, which is I don't control the time that it takes for a customer to, you know, go through the cycle of understanding. And And I often will throw out the quote that I first heard from an Air Force colleague probably 20 years ago, which was the first thing you ever hear about a new material or process is the best thing you'll ever hear about that new material or process. Because you learn things as you go along, and it's true today. I mean, we know a lot more about 3D printing than we did 20 years ago. I always throw out Scalmalloy as a great example, which is it has been around for 20 years. People know it. They know it's where its good points and its bad points, both of which are great to know. Only knowing the good things leaves you with, well, what don't I know? It leaves me with some uncertainty.
Right? But now Scamalloy is being qualified for additive and for commercial for Airbus.
Yeah.
So, but how long has that process gone? A long time.
A long time. Yeah, so I think your background in composites probably, I've always said additive is very similar to composites because you're sort of creating the material and the part simultaneously, which is kind of true in composites. I worked a little bit in metal matrix composites, but I sat with the composites team because it was always advanced manufacturing. It was always, I remember my wife watched a program on it and she was like, "Do you know anything about this composites?" And I'm like, "No, why?" And she goes, "Oh, it's going to be the material of the future." And I was like, "And it always will be."
Yeah, exactly. It's going to replace everything. And the number of pitch decks that I see where you can see the addressable market that they put out is to everything. And my first question to the founders always is, that's great. If you can solve everybody's problems, where do you start and why?
Hmm.
And that's where like, oh, well, that's why we brought you in, is maybe you can help us understand where we should start. And then that's when
Oh,
you go, oh, you're a long ways away. If you're asking me that question, that's not good.
I love that question.
Now speaking kind of like to the founders out there or somebody who thinks that they want to start a company, there's angels and VCs and bootstrapping and all of this stuff. And then there's the world of defense. And defense is hard for startups because of the cycle time and acquisition that you have to be able to live through. How do you usually advise those founders or, aspiring founders, like where should they focus? And I know there's no one right way to go, but how
Yeah.
do you give them that ABC's perspective?
Yeah, my answer's changing on this one, but my first response used to always be, when it comes to the government side, run and then go do everything else first, and then you can weather the long time horizons. But by the way, I'll come back and say, the SBIR programs has helped a lot of companies for sure.
Yeah.
Getting through the valley of death with it and getting into production is really sort of one of the key fundamental problems that I think that system has. The government has, I
But
think,
just a quick note on that. So like, I lived in Australia and they don't have an SBIR program. Consequently, there's a lot of small businesses and they never get there. So it's like, it's the small SBIRs, they're taking some heat, I think now, but it's like everything. You don't get all good and no bad.
right. Yeah, I mean, look, there's pros and cons to the program, and I don't want to make this whole thing about SBIR programs. I think I'll talk about the good parts. I think there's fundamentally some interesting problems that they're trying to solve with it. And what I like is when they pick parties that are focused on commercializing it, because there's a lot of engineering firms that are just SBIR shops, and all they want to do is SBIRs, and they have a lot of IP that's sort of sitting on a shelf, and they'll never see the light of day, but it's government funded, and that doesn't really help anybody. So, but when it's aligned right, and I think that's where kind of moving towards, and it started with DIUX in sort of the mid kind of 2010 eras, where that's the Defense Innovation Unit experimental. And I largely will pick on the program when it first came out and said, hey, this is just a way for Obama to get some of his key VC contributors some money back from the government because you just plop a couple people down in Silicon Valley and how are they going to really solve the problem? And I think when they iterated on the program, they went through three different leaders fairly quickly. One of my teammates at Newcap joined DIUX sort of maybe 2015, 16 timeframe. And they started organizing and trying to figure out more problems to solve. And they got some wins too. Again, we're not going to get everything right, but I think what we're seeing is we're trying as the government to, one, figure out how to innovate faster, how to change our contracting vehicles so that we can accommodate these kinds of technologies faster. And it doesn't happen overnight, but I think the trend line is looking better. Now we have AFWorks and SpaceWorks and all kinds of new innovative programs inside of the government to help push these technologies along. So in a way, the trend is all right. Is there a good and bad? Sure, there's both in this equation, but I think we're seeing a lot of progress being made from that standpoint. But I do think that's, it does lay a foundation where it's a shared risk model for investors. I think investors sort of look at this a little bit different now. It's nice that the government has put money into the R&D development side, as long as it doesn't bind the company from pursuing some of the commercial initiatives that they could also do and have other customers, and allows them sort of the way to develop things for the government alongside. I think it's a great setup. And so but now I think when we get to some places like space, you might be beholden to the government entirely, and so the government has to have ways to work through that with investors if that's what they want to do. So, and we're seeing like in the success of Anduril on the funding side is probably another example in terms of drones. That's another example of these are going to be one-way drones are going to be defense. There's no commercial application for it, and there's becoming a big appetite for it. So this again needs to be how does the government play in this and share in the risk, because the VCs can't take it all on themselves. And if they did, by the way, you're not going to like the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up Anduril. So there's a wave of excitement around the Andurils, the SpaceX, the Palantirs, all of these new entrants, more like positioned as future of defense. What's your take on this? And I guess more like the financial take. Do you see this as a viable path forward in the way that they're structured, the way that they're raising money, the markets that they're pursuing?
Oh boy, this is a loaded question. I'll probably get in trouble for it. So
We can always edit.
no, no,
It's
no,
okay.
no, 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 no. That's keep that in.
Beep.
I think, and I say that for a reason. I think the landscape is shifting, right? I think we've seen this phase. If we take space, for instance, because when I took a hard pivot into 3D printing, I was also taking a hard pivot into covering space as well. I pulled out of the space market from Newcap being dedicated in it. Largely, it was sort of this mentality. If you would have walked around in 2015 to all the Space 2.0 events, it was like all the primes are dead and we're going to do everything better. And you see Planet Labs putting up CubeSats that have a fraction of the capability of what's probably really required for important missions. But it sounds cool, right? And so everybody loves it. And it's like, oh, this is the entire future. Where are we today with space? They're fully integrated. You've got, Boeing's bought Millennium Space Systems. You're looking at sort of the landscape. I don't see the primes going away. They have to sort of shift a little bit in their businesses to accommodate lower cost systems, not building just, what Joint Strike Fighters anymore, but we're going to look at various, high volume types of production systems. Anduril hasn't proven, frankly, that they have the production chops at this point. If I go around and I talk to everybody and I go, do I like the story of Anduril? There are things I love about the story of Anduril. Have they proven that they can deliver things at scale yet? I don't know the answer to that one, and I don't think anybody's fully answered it. So I think that my fear is we're going to go through another cycle. And when I think about sort of Anduril, this happens. I'm going to use 3D printing as the analogy. There's a couple companies that'll suck all of the money out of the room. Desktop Metal is a perfect example in 3D printing. And if they're not successful, then all of a sudden everybody's going to get soured on it. And when I think about sort of the Andurils of the world, a lot of the big VC firms are becoming lobbying firms. Andreessen Horowitz is almost now in a lobbying firm as much as they are anything else. You see them, the access they have to the White House. Peter Thiel, obviously with Founders Fund, same thing. So they're built in sort of in this ecosystem of government lobbying and putting their companies in place. Does it mean they always fund the best companies? The answer is no. Matter of fact, they're going to have blind spots. So I think there's a place for them in the world. I think they're innovating new business models and they're disrupting the primes, and the primes need to be disrupted to some extent. So I'm optimistic about that, but I think there's going to be some growing pains with these companies as well. And it's harder for the smaller when you have these kinds of companies that take so much capital out, it makes it sometimes harder for the others. And it makes really, and I think, again, a moat that these VCs want. We want to fund if you come onto our funding stream, we're going to help you out in a lot of different ways other than just capital. And that works sometimes, but it sort of also minimizes some of the innovation because they're trying to put big moats around it and keeping others out. So it's a blessing and a curse.
Is there, my fear on the defense side anyway, because that's my background, but I'm some would say that I'm soft on the legacy primes, but it's a pretty difficult business. And it is a lot of times understanding the intent behind what the product is meant to do as much as it is being able to do it and having the chops to do it, as you said. So my fear is that you'll have these companies and they'll have losses for years. I mean, SpaceX is still not profitable. So it could just theoretically, I guess it could disappear, when it runs out of money, if somebody decides not to keep giving it money. And then where are we? So if you damage those legacy primes, sucking all the money away, is there a fear of that? I guess is my question. Or there is a fear. It's my fear. Is it legitimate?
Yeah, I'm also pretty quick to throw sharp elbows to the primes, but at the same time, like I said, I think there's a place for them in the world. I don't think they go away. I think they have to. They're going when you build a very complex system, and SpaceX is obviously a great example of somebody that's done it exceptionally well. But I don't think some of the smaller drones fit the exceptionally challenging systems like a Joint Strike Fighter. I don't
Hmm.
see where any of those
It's,
companies are really moving into that role yet. But I think what we have to look at is where do they fit, what kinds of systems, and because the primes again also don't do well at high volume, low cost items. So, that's something we're going to see, and that's where drones might come in and robotics might come in. So we're looking more like automotive kinds of companies now where production, and this is something where I feel pretty strongly about. I think our government and really we all have to look at manufacturing systems as weapon systems because it's going to be our capacity to produce, I think, lower cost, high volume to be competitive in this sort of new drone warfare model that we're going into. And having the most expensive F-22 may not be the only game. Matter of fact, it might just be a small piece of what you need, but not the entire game. And I think what we have right now is a gap. And when we compete against China, China has exceptional manufacturing capabilities, right? And I think that's what people are not cognizant of. We need to build that capability in Europe, in North America, and we're still not there yet. We're getting there. We have the ability to build some of the most complex systems on the planet, but can we do it at scale? Can we do it in a cost competitive way?
you said a key point there, which is I don't think it can just be a U.S. solution. I don't know we're gonna go one on one. Having allies that are in Europe and elsewhere having capacity is sort of a necessary part of the equation, isn't it?
Well, I think everybody needs to have some form of capacity, and everybody shouldn't just be dependent on one group, right? If all of a sudden, right, if all of Europe and all of North America and say Israel are all dependent upon Raytheon, boy, that's a single point of failure. And so what we need here is a diversification of our industrial base. That's one problem that we have. And so I think what's happening right now this fragmentation with Europe, working on some of the European defense deals that we are, there's a real benefit that's going on to the economies in Europe by starting to take control. The Rheinmetalls of the world, and BAEs and others are beneficiaries of Europe starting to develop their own systems. Now, what we need is interoperability between these systems, but they
Hmm.
don't have to necessarily be the same systems. So I think that's going to be the key is how do we design systems and understand so we can operate together. And that's by the way, no easy task at all. But that is, I think, something that's going to be super fundamentally important going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the US funded F-22 100%, but the F-35 was funded by seven different countries.
Right.
On the global front, and some of these new entrants, like a lot of what I hear when I'm out and about and at conferences is how the new technologies that are developed and some of the new entrants are really being proven in the Ukraine situation. And just curious, from your perspective, does like the performance in the battleground, does that have any financial? Like, do you look at that? Is that a point for you to be like, hey, this is actually you're more mature or you're worth more, or like how does that play in or doesn't it?
Now that's it's an interesting question, and I think you'll see companies are getting funded. Like Firestorm's doing a great job of raising money right now on sort of downrange production capability using MJF, the HP MJF multi-jet fusion printers inside of a container, and designing and developing unique mission profiles. And we can all see a need. So when I take a step back, and maybe this is where I get a little bit jaded, is the question that I think looking at Ukraine and what's going on in drone warfare is, I think it's a wake-up call. Everybody's looking at what's going on there because it's the first real war that we've ever fought. And I compare and contrast that with what's going on in Iran right now. Iran is a redo of the Gulf War, right? It's this is the that's if you go back to the first Gulf War, right? This is where the Air Force was the big winner, right? Air superiority, precision guided munitions. Let's go down that path. And anybody making precision guided munitions and was kind of tied to air superiority, their stocks went up, and everybody was loving it. And if you're in the Air Force, like that was it, right? As an Air Force person waving the flag, Air Force is better than Navy and Army, woohoo. But I don't think that's what wins wars. And I think that's what we now look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq afterwards. You don't win wars with air power. And now all of a sudden you watch this sort of on the ground Ukraine situation. Where I worry a little bit is I think our military leaders they don't adapt well sometimes, and that's a very pointed thing to say. But what I mean by that is the Air Force is run by fighter pilots, and the fighter pilot mafia is an example. And the answer is fighters, right? And this is not they've always been a little resistant. The Air Force hasn't been the best adopter of drone technologies. And this sort of cuts into our budgets, how we operate, how we think. And so, how quickly can they pivot? How quickly do they want to integrate these systems? And we may be reliant upon the Army and the Marines and the Navy to step up their game. And that's what's happened historically in drones, frankly, is that other services has had to have a play. And this is where I think the requirements side of it. How are we going to define it? How are we going to adopt these systems? Because right now, the government isn't one thing. The Department of War is not one thing. It is a highly fragmented group that is extremely competitive with one another for their budgets. So when I was in the Air Force and I worked in that strategic planning side of the world, I was in this weird world where when programs would come out, like space-based infrared system, it was a fight politically who gets to manage the program. Did the NRO, because it's a sensing-based platform, the National Reconnaissance Office, did they get it? Or does the Materiel Command get to manage it on behalf of Space Command? These are very hard problems to solve. I mean, and these are the legacy problems that we've always had in the military. So if if control looks like, hey, I need to get more fighters, then I think we're gonna, you can look at what's going on in Ukraine and go, I can see where the future is gonna go. I just hope we can keep up. And that's sort of the problem when I make a bet. And this is where I think again, what's happening now with Andreessen Horowitz and others, they've been courting in senior military people early on. A16Z, that's Andreessen Horowitz, has always had an open door to various military groups to kind of come in and try to push these things. It helps enable them to have a seat at the table. Doesn't mean they have the best systems always, but I think they're trying to understand and they're trying to frame their bets of where this can go, where they might fit into the funding stack. So we have to look at Ukraine, I think, with a keen eye. You can see how effective these drones have been. What's going to be interesting is how quickly do we adopt them? And because everybody sitting behind it from a manufacturing standpoint has to understand if I'm going to put machines on the ground to go make these, it doesn't matter what machines, 3D printed machines, traditional manufacturing machines, castings, you name it. I need to know what this future looks like before I start making the investments to do it.
Yeah, I like that because, we often say here, we're like, we don't have as many technical problems. We have people problems. It's like the adoption rate that's people and the battle at the top for maybe what's best and what's mine it will come out and we'll play.
Maybe a pointed question to you on the VC front and their, I'll say, recent interest in defense tech. And I look at that and I get part of it. But the other side is I know, as you do, that profit is capped as a defense company. How do I? It's a very illogical argument, it seems to me in some ways. Like if I'm a VC, why would I be investing in something where my profitability is limited?
Well, this is potentially the paradigm shift, right? And Andrel's the one that's trying to do this first, which is we're becoming a defense products company, is what they're calling themselves. So I'm not where you're capped is when the way the government, and I think about space in particular, but this is true for fighters or for most defense systems, there was no commercial market for these, right? SpaceX can charge whatever they, pretty much whatever they want. Now, they weren't funded by the Department of War to go out and develop. Matter of fact, they had to sue the Department of War for not allowing them to bid on government contracts for launch when the competitors were using RD-180 Russian rocket engines at ULA, right? Insane. Like blows my mind. Here we are. The Defense Department only wants to back Russian rocket engines. And here's somebody that started up, developed their own systems, and are basically precluded from bidding. That's where we were in 2012 timeframe, 13, right? Early days. And people don't remember that because now we look at SpaceX and go, great. But SpaceX didn't design their system. The government didn't pay for the development of that system, so they can charge what they want for a system, right? And now, if you look at what Anduril is trying to do, their same playbook. They saw that and said, "Hey, wait a second. I'm going to design. I'm not. You're not defining my requirement anymore. What you're going to do is I'm going to come up with new solutions for you, and you can buy them." And so they're not capped from their profit standpoint the way sort of the traditional Lockheed, Boeings, we'd all come out and the government would put a requirements definition together. We'd decide what we want. We'd fight over it for 2, 3 years, right? And then we'd come out with a program and all you guys, Lockheed, Boeing, and Raytheon, and everybody would bid on it. We'd pick a winner. By the time we're done with that process, we're 4 years in. By the time somebody builds something, we're fielding 10-year-old technology, right? By the time we get through the production program. And then what I think Andrew is trying to do is why are we doing it this way? First of all, we can't afford to field 10-year-old technology. Matter of fact, the government may not always know and be the smartest buyer for themselves. So if they can redefine what the requirement capabilities that they can deliver very quickly, and then the government can come back and say, yeah, that's what we want, then they can avoid the cost plus contracting mechanism. And I think that's the goal of what they're trying to do. Um, We'll see how it works out. I think there's going to be a blended of both, right? I think the government's going to need certain kinds of capabilities, and they're going to still have programs they manage, and they'll have cost plus contracts. But then the commercial market's now leaning in and starting to do things where we can add on capabilities to it, but we don't pay for the whole program.
So I find this shift, this acquisition priority and contract type shift very interesting. And I think this is where John is glad to let me nerd out on that stuff. What's your thoughts on this? The executive order recently that came down and talked, primarily firm fix going forward. I mean, it makes a lot of sense with things that like the approach that they're taking, where they're defining the requirements, selling a commercial product. What about some of the defense and I'll say like even like existing programs? How will this affect? Do you have any thoughts on how this is going to play out in the near and long term?
I don't know if I know the latest executive order, so
Just
uh,
prioritizing firm fixed price. Let's say that over cost plus.
Over
Even
yeah,
time and materials.
renegotiating some.
Yeah.
look, I think there's places for firm fixed price in the world. I think I understand why we have cost plus as well, because sometimes there's always requirements creep, right? And this is especially the think Joint Strike Fighter, and you've got 7 nations coming at it, and you're like, oh, wait a second, we need to change this now. And so it's hard to do things when you have a firm fixed price kind of contract. I think for drones, I think drones being a great place is this is one of those areas, especially for the one-way smaller drones, and I'm gonna not just I'm not thinking just quadcopter kinds of drones, but even smaller sort of fixed-wing drones. I think those fit well into this new paradigm of move quickly, break things, and this has to change the paradigm of the Defense Department too. Is they're extremely risk averse, and they have been for a long time. And so I think the idea of the contracting vehicles, I'm less concerned about the firm fixed price nature, and because that, by the way, the firm fixed price leans itself to the Andrils of the world. I know what I'm selling you. I can already, bake in my costs. I can fix the price. It may not help, by the way, the traditional primes here. But I think it's a way to at least know what we're getting going in. But I really think the bigger name of the game is knowing what we need from a requirements definition, where we want to be, right? What's the life cycle of these going to look like? And, I think the contracting vehicles, how do we bring in solutions and get people on contract that have unique capabilities without doing sort of the full bid processes? Because sometimes that alone sets everybody back a couple years.
The previous point around, if you develop a system yourself, you can charge what you want for it. Uh, there was an example in the region in Iran where it basically went to supply and demand. So the need for this system went up. So the commercial provider could charge whatever they wanted. They surged the price, and then the Defense Department didn't like it. That was sort of what you asked for. I mean, that you wanted commercial stuff and you didn't want to invest in it, and then you kind of have to deal with the after effect. So it's always just, I think it's just facing a new reality. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I just think it was nobody thought about it. It was like, oh, wait a minute, I might actually pay more for something in a tight situation because it follows basic supply and demand economics.
Yeah, and I don't know the true economics on some of those scenarios, but when you don't have to cover the cost of putting something on orbit per se, and you don't have to cover the cost of designing and building and all of the things that go into it, and you're paying a services contract kind of a scenario, even if they up the cost of that service contract, you're probably still winning in a big way. And think about the time and duration of how long does it take, if you take Starlink, for example, how long does it take for them to design and iterate a new Starlink versus a new Milsatcom satellite? I mean, it's eons of time different and cost different. So yeah, I don't have a great answer, but I think it's yeah, for
It
sure.
was it was
You
really
don't
more of an
control the
observation.
process.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got anything else, Jen? You got a
Oh, I have one closing one.
All
Yeah.
right, go for it.
So if you could redesign how capital flows into the DIB, what would it look like?
I have a belief, and I can't say it's fully vetted, but I think what we really need right now is a little bit more long-term capital. And I say that because the 10-year funds that we have today are fairly short. Private equity can't really innovate. And if you're going to ask these companies, and they're buying up a lot of the machine shops today are being backed by private equity. Do they want to go install a couple 3D printers today to go into something new where they don't have a defined set of returns, right? I think these are the things that, they don't have a program already set up because you can't buy these kinds of systems and expect that you can just turn them on and go. If they had more time horizon to develop and integrate and not get penalized from R&D, and we got, by the way, the whole R&D tax credit sort of issues that we had under the Biden administration were devastating. And there's a number of
Mhm.
companies that just had to close their doors because you'd get $1 million contract, and all of a sudden, right, you would basically only be able to amortize your costs. You couldn't expense everything the year is incurred. So you get these massive tax bills, and yet there was no cash to pay it. So we need to make sure we keep the R&D tax credits issues completely intact, one, to incentivize companies to do it. If we could have longer duration funds that are out there, and that's just hard in the private capital markets, but China doesn't have a problem with it. That's what we're up against, really, is how do you compete against state-sponsored, long-term capital against ours? We need to think through that. And I normally it would be like you would never heard me 10 years ago saying, these government private partner, types of, relationships. I would have just kicked myself into the table right now, even saying something like that. But I think we have to evaluate what's going to be fundamentally important. And when we think about scaling manufacturing infrastructure, I don't see private equity doing it by themselves. They won't take
Mhm.
that risk. So I think longer term funds, I think some understanding of what the future state that we need for these systems and weapon systems that we're going to want, and understanding what the manufacturing kinds of needs are going to be. Long term, I think government is sort of coming in to help reestablish some of it as a beneficiary, not putting the full risk on private capital because they will not do it, or we will be so far behind China we won't be competitive. So I think it's a function to me of making sure R&D tax credits stay in place, getting some longer term funds, and then allowing, I think, more interaction with the government. I think the government just needs to break their paradigm. And instead of having a bunch of gatekeepers and lobbyists, I think they need really better visibility on how to analyze the technologies from a manufacturing materials standpoint coming out. Because if I hear about Deloitte getting another contract to tell the government what to do, we're just pissing money away, and they're not really going to deliver what we really want. I think we need to have smarter teams helping advise the government here too, that level the playing field so that small companies can play.
Got anything to say about that, Jen?
Oh, I just like doing that kind of thing. And we find that that's true, right? Like in our government customers that we serve at TBGA, oftentimes they need help understanding and keeping up with trends, and they have so much in front of them and so many decisions to make, and they need to react so quickly with a lot of these budget cycles that it's hard for them to have the data in front of them to make informed investment decisions for sure. And I love the comment about China that we that's what we're up against. It's someone with a 90-year plan who is incredibly patient with their investment, right? The private equity, they're not going to be. And so what is the government's obligation with that? And how does it complement what private equity is interested in doing? So
Yeah, I
I
mean,
liked this.
and it's just has to align interest. It's not that private equity is bad. They just have a return threshold. They have to return money to their investors.
Mm,
They can't take, and they're not venture capitalists. They have, where they only need 1 out of 10 to hit. They can't afford
Yeah.
to lose any one of their investments, right? Because they're really sort of buying companies, levering up the cash flows, trying to pay the debt back, grow them a little bit, and that's they're getting a spread on what they have to pay back from their investors. So they can't afford a lot of risk, and I think, but they control a lot of the operational manufacturing capability in this
Mm.
country. So for
Machine
them, we
shops.
just
Yeah.
need to have an alignment between public and private capital so
Mm.
that there's a piece that can be distributed and we understand what we're going to get into. So but we're a little ways away from that. I just, I think on the early stage stuff, I'm a big believer again. I think there's just too many gatekeepers and lobbyists and everybody sitting around, and we need better ways to have these kind of discussions with the government. The problem is the government's not one thing. So DLA has very different decision-making ability than AFRL, which is very different than SPA War at the Navy, which is very different than SOCOMs. And, that's why you can go down the list and they're all different. They all have different capabilities, and even within those commands, they're fighting each other. So it's a tough thing to do, but I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to continue to push down this because I think what one group learns, hopefully the others can follow. And and again, I am more encouraged today than I was, I'd say 7, 8 years ago in terms of where the government's going and their acquisition cycles. So it's improving. That's my positive. I think I just look at the speed at which China's going, and shipbuilding is going to be sort of I think one of the key areas for manufacturing is how do we incorporate traditional manufacturing, weldings and castings and these kinds of technologies into shipbuilding is going to be so. I think it's going to be so important. I hope we are doing it well. And John, I know you guys have, and Jen, you too, have been involved, and working with some of the I think if the Office of Secretary of Defense and some of the key people there just to kind of keep them aligned. And so there's a lot to do still, but I think we're moving in the right direction. I just hope we can move a little faster to keep pace with our counterparts in Asia.
yeah, I think it's all. I would agree. It's all doable, and the Defense Department's huge. It's well resourced overall, but it's like everything. If you try to do everything, you'll do nothing, and that's probably why there's so many smaller tribes of groups out there. Well, Danny, I think this has been a very interesting conversation, and also Jen, thanks for joining me this time around. Thanks to the listeners. Tell your friends. Point out we have a team supporting us. So Lauren Barnes edits and produces the podcast, and we have the TBGA team of Christina Kurth, Lexi Perham, and Cynthia Rogers for helping us out. So. Danny, we'll see you at the next event, I'm sure, and appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks both, John. Jen, it's a pleasure. And yeah, I'll see you probably maybe IMTS coming up in September.
Sounds like a plan.
Great.
All right.
Cleared for takeoff.
You've been listening to Manufacturing Mavericks, hosted by John Barnes and powered by the Barnes Global Advisors. Take a moment and subscribe to our channel.